So this is totally on me. Originally, this video was intended to be a quick response to some Christian apologist talking points. But while watching them, my research sense started tingling and I just couldn't help myself but start digging in. Fortunately, that wound up being a good thing because as it turns out, there was just so much more to unpack here. So I'm gonna lay the foundation here as quickly as I can so we can get on to the responses. The clips that you're about to see come from a program put on by One Life Church in Evansville, Indiana. One Life is a non-denominational church that focuses primarily on the ideas of biblical inerrancy, Trinitarianism, and pretty much all things Jesus-y. Basically, for these guys, coming to Jesus is just one big happy party and everybody's invited, so long as you leave your reason and your logic with your car keys in the bowl at the door. One Life Church also runs the One Life Network here on YouTube, where they spend most of their time generating apologetics content with clickbait thumbnails and clout chasing by posting cherry-picked clips from various conversations with various famous talking heads. Now in these clips we're checking out today, One Life Church brought on for one of its programs Eric Hernandez as a guest speaker. For those of you who don't know, Eric is a Texas-based Baptist church affiliated pastor, and according to the bio on his website, he specializes in apologetics from a faith and philosophical approach. He authored the book The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, which has been endorsed by fellow apologist grifters Mike Lacona, Frank Turek, and Lee Strobel, whose name Eric apparently can't spell correctly on his website. Eric also claims to be a licensed minister, which just means that he's met the requirements subjectively set by the Baptist Church, which allows him to speak on behalf of that denomination. He's a certified formation therapist, which is essentially just a life coach that focuses on personal growth through reconciling one's past, as opposed to teaching accountability and setting and accomplishing goals for oneself. And he's the apologetics lead and millennial specialist for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which is just a fancy way of saying that his target demographic are those individuals whose upbringing was predominantly influenced by the advent of the internet.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
He also claims to have an associate's in social science from some unspecified college, a bachelor's in wishful thinking, theology, also unspecified, and the real winner, a certificate of apologetics from Biola University, which it turns out he received after studying such mind-blowing topics such as evidence for the resurrection, solving the problem of evil, and Darwinism in crisis. Yeah, intellectual honesty has never really been in Biola's wheelhouse. But hey, what more could you possibly expect from a 3-session, $195 online-only course with zero educational prerequisites? Lastly, the specific clips that we're checking out today were taken directly from Eric's nearly 40-minute presentation at One Life, and considering that One Life opted to only post 3 of them to their channel, I think that gives us a good idea as to the general logical consistency and coherency of his presentation. That all said, take it away, Eric.
I was once talking with a young lady, and she said, "Eric, you cannot claim that Christianity is true because there is no truth."
If you're at all familiar with the arguments presented by presuppositional apologists and proponents of the transcendental argument for God, or TAG, then I'm pretty sure you've heard multiple iterations of the example that Eric just presented. The thing that's kind of weird here is that Eric doesn't identify as a presuppositional apologist, likely because he understands philosophy well enough to know why that position is philosophically bankrupt.
And I said, "Really? Well, I just have one question." I said, "Is that true? Because you're telling me that there is no truth, but then you told me that as if what you just said was true. But if there is no truth, and by your own standards, what you just said cannot be true, it's what you call in philosophy self-defeating."
So, taking this tiny little fragment as is, what Eric is saying here does have the appearance of being correct. If one blanketly holds that truth is impossible, then how can one possibly make truth statements? The problem is, Eric's representation here is deeply intellectually dishonest, as it doesn't even scratch the surface of what really is a very dense topic. Firstly, there are multiple philosophical positions that one can hold regarding the concept of truth. One can hold to relativism, skepticism, deflationary theory, constructivism, and even nihilism. In relativism, it is held that truth propositions cannot be ascertained to an absolute degree, and as such, that which is true is relative to various other factors such as individual beliefs, historical periods, and cultural norms. In skepticism, the possibility of attaining absolute certitude is questioned, and this includes what we would ostensibly call mind-independent or objective truth. Deflationary theory posits that the concept of truth is not a substantive property of statements, and as such is redundant, essentially not adding anything of value to the statement beyond the information that it's initially conveying. Constructivism posits that truth is not discovered, but rather constructed through social processes, and nihilism, the most radical stance, simply makes the positive assertion that objective truth does not exist. But there is also probabilism, also called mitigated skepticism, which is a position that doesn't deny the possibility of knowledge, but views it as being subject to a matter of degree or credence. This particular area is where we get into things like rationality and probability axioms, Bayesian epistemology, and fallibilism, all of which are subjects that, while important in their own right, are far deeper than I need to go for the purposes of this video. Secondly, while we do have a basic understanding of Eric's own philosophical position regarding truth, from his own implication that for absolute truth to even exist, his God must necessarily exist because that's the definition he's been conditioned to ascribe to it, and you probably notice that this implies that his position is basically that either his God exists or epistemic nihilism is true, which is a false dichotomy, which is a major fallacy committed by presuppositional apologists, even though he himself doesn't identify as a presuppositional apologist. But I digress. We don't know the full philosophical position of the person that Eric was talking to in this example, if he's even representing this interaction appropriately, or if it even happened at all. What I can tell you is that every tag proponent and presup that I've ever engaged with has some version of this same example built into their own scripts. Thirdly, I don't hold that it can be expected for every single person in the world to find this stuff as interesting as I do, even if this interaction that Eric is describing actually happened. Just because a person lacks the education to articulate their position accurately is not an argument for the oppositional position being true. Pointing out the uninformed philosophical critiques of another does not justification for one's own position make. So while at first blush what Eric is presenting here has the appearance of being salient, he's really just banking on his captive audience's lack of philosophical acumen so that he can spread his narrative unchallenged. And it's this very kind of predatory intellectual dishonesty that more people need to be able to recognize to better protect themselves, their children, and their wallets.
Or consider this. I've had atheists say, Eric, give me scientific evidence for God.
Yeah, we've heard apologists lament ad nauseum about atheists pushing back on their positive God claim by requesting the evidence that supports it for the purposes of critical evaluation. Hate to break it to you, Eric, but if you claim that it exists as a concrete thing in reality and that everyone else should believe it too, then you should be able to readily provide the evidence necessary to warrant that belief. Also, when he says scientific evidence here, what he's really referring to is empirical evidence, which would be evidence that conforms to the verification principle, meaning that it can be demonstrated to support the truth of the proposition about external reality through established methodological means. The problem is, Eric is about to fall into the trap that he doesn't realize was set by his own worldview.
And my response is usually, and why would I want to do a silly thing like that?
Yeah, why should you be expected to provide actual evidence that supports the single claim that your entire worldview is predicated upon and that you think every person in the world should accept as being true for whatever psychologically manipulative reason you've come up with today?
Sorry, what was I thinking?
And because there's a look of confusion, I say, let me explain it this way. God, if he exists, is a non-physical, by definition, a non-physical entity. And science is a wonderful tool, but it is a tool that is limited to only studying the physical world. So you cannot use something like science, which is limited to the physical, to try and investigate something non-physical. It is a category fallacy.
And that's the trap that Eric unknowingly set for himself. If it was the case that the only attribute that he ascribed to his God was that it was immaterial, that attribute and nothing else, then yes, what he is describing would be a category error. How could one possibly expect empirical evidence of something that is categorically non-empirical? But that's not the totality of what Eric believes. Per Eric's theistic worldview, he holds that while his God is immaterial in nature, it also interacts directly with the material world. Such actions are often called miracles. I'm sure you've heard of them at some point. But in keeping with the laws of logic, a God action cannot be indistinguishable from what would ostensibly be completely naturalistic phenomenon, or a non-God action. Understanding this, in order for us humans to coherently categorize any observed phenomena as being a God action, there must be an independently confirmed mechanism, something that we could use to develop a predictive model that would allow us to reliably distinguish between God actions and non-God actions in the future. Such a predictive model would provide us empirical evidence of the God's existence. And even though such evidence would be indirect in nature, at least it would give us a fantastic new starting place for a line of justifiable inquiry. So what Eric is actually doing here is actively misrepresenting himself, presenting his own worldview as being indistinguishable from something unfalsifiable like classical deism, just so he can avoid having to address the problematic logical entailments of his theistic worldview. He then goes on to analogize this little point with the example of a person standing on a litter strewn sand-strewn beach claiming there is no plastic after having swept the sand with a metal detector, which is really just his way of protecting his intellectual dishonesty by not so subtly calling those people who ask for evidence stupid.
I was once invited a few years ago to speak for this youth group. So as the youth pastor invites me up that evening, he says, just take a few minutes and introduce yourself, tell people what you do.
You specialize in presenting Christianity to uneducated minds in an emotionally attractive yet intellectually dishonest manner so as to better the chances of cultivating future members for the cult?
Ooh, that's a bingo.
So I briefly mention apologetics, but I say, you know what, but if you have questions about that, see me after the service, we can talk.
Sadly, I doubt anything substantive, if anything at all, was discussed there.
As I concluded and I walked to my seat, I began to gather my things, and out of the corner of my eye, I see this young man and his mom, and they're just like rushing towards me.
So a parent and a child are rushing at you after your presentation. Could the setup be any more obvious?
And they like come right towards me, and they stand right in front of me. And then what he said next broke my heart. He said, well, I'm an atheist.
Given that we don't really know how old this kid is, it's hard to say if he even really knows what his own position is. It could just be that he simply doesn't believe in the existence of a god or gods, and that's about as far as he can articulate it.
I don't want to come to church, but my mom forces me to come, so I come.
I think this tells us that the kid is on the younger side. Oh, and by the way, great parenting. Forcing your kid to do something that is completely voluntary that they have zero interest or investment in just because you've been convinced it's somehow important won't make them resent the experience or you at all.
But I had questions. As I began to ask these questions to those in my youth group, they couldn't answer them. So they sent me to the youth pastor, and he couldn't answer them. And it's gotten to the point to where the pastor and the youth pastor have sat me down, and they said, look, if you're going to come to church, that's fine, but sit down, shut up, and stop bothering people with your questions.
That's it. We are left with the setup. The kid claims he's a non-believer. His mom forces him to go to church. He asks lots of questions, which is a good thing, but apparently the questions annoy the leadership, so they admonish him for it, which is a bad thing. I think I'm safe in saying that a lot of us are intimately familiar with this scenario. The problem is, when One Life Network uploaded this short, they titled it Part 1. There is no Part 2, unless of course you're willing to take the time to go and check out Eric's full 40-minute presentation.
No, I don't think I will.
Which, by the way, I did, so you don't have to. So I'll give you the quick and dirty on it. Partly because the whole thing was intended to be a setup for another round of reductive and intellectually dishonest philosophy, but mostly because it's some of the most performative bullshit I've seen since Jordan Peterson's Jubilee humiliation. To summarize, Eric goes on for the next 3 minutes explaining how he spent an hour answering the kids' questions, and then he proceeds to talk to the unnamed pastor of this unnamed church in unnamed small town Texas about the extremely concerning reality that there is an atheist in the youth group.
Dun, dun, dun.
And Eric is afraid that if the problem isn't resolved, then that atheist kid is going to take half the youth group with him. Where he's going to take them, Eric never specifies, but I'm just going to assume that he means hell. So he offers the pastor his card and says to give it to the kid so maybe he can talk to the kid on the phone and use his powers of apologetics to solve the problem. But then Eric tearfully laments that that kid was probably never given his card, which does problematically imply that the hour he spent answering this kid's questions did not substantively address anything the kid brought up. But even better, Eric then goes on to shift the blame for this kid's atheism onto the church community for not engaging in his level of apologetics. And all of this is just a setup for him to dive into another woefully reductive lecture against truly diabolical concepts like postmodern thought and moral relativism, all while conveniently ignoring the begging the question fallacy that he commits at the center of his own worldview, and the fact that the manner in which he defines his God as being that which is ultimate actually confirms moral relativism per the Euthyphro dilemma. Maybe Eric's approach to philosophy is a little too much like his approach to evangelism, because if it weren't, he would at least have a basic understanding of the very fallacies that he's committing in order to justify the conclusions that he's already assuming are true. But in any case, I hope some of you out there do now, and as such are now better equipped to counter manipulative charlatans like this guy who only seek to prey upon your vulnerabilities for their own gain. Be safe, be excellent to each other. I'll see you next time.